Police officers shot Ronda Rousey's dog, unaware of who they were dealing with. A few seconds later, everything changed. Subscribe. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments. The park had always been a sanctuary for Rhonda, a place where the noise of the city melted into the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of traffic far beyond the green. On this particular evening, the air was warm, but not heavy, touched by the last strokes of a sunset that spilled gold and rose across the sky. A breeze came from the west, carrying the scent of cut grass from a field where groundskeepers had been working earlier in the day. The sound of a distant lawnmower was gone now, replaced by the soft rhythm of footsteps and the occasional laughter of families heading home for dinner. This was the kind of moment she cherished, quiet, unhurried, the world moving at a pace that allowed her to breathe. Beside her trotted Mason, her pit bull, his broad head held high and his eyes alert but calm. He walked with an easy stride, a muscular shadow in the waning light, his leash loose because he needed no constant correction. Mason was more than a pet. He was her steadfast companion, her confidant in silent moments, and her reminder that loyalty wasn't just a word but a way of living. Years ago, she had pulled him from a shelter where his life hung by a thread, labeled as too aggressive by people who had never taken the time to understand him. In her hands, he had become the model of discipline, steady, reliable, and gentle with children who ran up to him in the park. Those who lived in the neighborhood knew him, and more than once she had seen strangers smile when they spotted him from a distance. They followed the paved path through the park's central stretch, the trees leaning overhead like watchful guardians. Occasionally she stopped to let Mason greet a familiar face, a jogger who always carried a pocket full of biscuits, an elderly woman who sat on the same bench each evening feeding birds, a small group of kids on the playground who squealed with delight when Mason rolled onto his back for belly rubs. The children's laughter wrapped around her like warm sunlight, making the world feel far away from the headlines and the constant noise of conflict she knew too well. The peace felt rare to her, a gift she didn't often get. Rhonda was used to intensity, to the adrenaline of competition and the grueling focus of training camps. But here she could be just another person in comfortable clothes, her hair pulled back, her guard down. The rhythm of Mason's steps matched her own, a syncopated beat against the path that eased the tension in her shoulders. She breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the smell of grass, the faint sweetness of blooming flowers, the earthy scent of Mason's coat when she glanced down at him. It was in this moment, when she felt the most at ease, that the air shifted. At first it was subtle, just a change in the ambient noise, a drop in chatter, a certain sharpness in the breeze. Then she noticed them. 2 uniformed police officers had appeared on the far end of the path, their figures framed by the fading light. They weren't walking like men on duty. There was no patrol posture, no alert scanning of the surroundings. Instead, their movements were casual to the point of arrogance, hands in their pockets, voices carrying just enough for her to hear the tone if not the words. One had the build of a man who had spent time in the gym, but not enough to hide the soft curve at his waist. The other was leaner, his face sharper, the kind that kept its expression close but its eyes calculating. She felt Mason's head tilt slightly, his ears pivoting toward them. He didn't growl, but the muscles along his back tightened just enough for her to notice. Rhonda slowed her pace, not out of fear but to measure them. She had learned long ago that danger often announced itself in the way people carried themselves before they spoke. When they were close enough, their voices became clear. "Well, look what we've got here," the taller one said, his grin lazy and unpleasant. "Evening, sweetheart. Taking your muscle for a stroll?" His eyes swept over her in a way that made it clear the comment wasn't about Mason. The other man gave a short, humorless laugh, his gaze flicking between her and the dog. "That's a mean-looking animal," he said, though his tone carried no genuine concern, only the baiting rhythm of someone trying to provoke. Rhonda's instinct was to shut it down before it escalated. "He's licensed, trained, and leashed," she replied evenly, keeping her voice calm. "We're just out for a walk." She tugged gently on Mason's lead, and he responded immediately, sitting beside her. Posture perfect. It was a picture of control, a silent statement of the discipline she had instilled in him. But the grin on the taller officer's face didn't fade. If anything, it deepened, as if her composure was a challenge he felt compelled to break. "Yeah, well, we've got a duty to make sure dangerous dogs don't hurt anyone," he said, his hand brushing the edge of his duty belt in a way that made the gesture look casual, though she caught the glint of the holster in the fading light. The other officer didn't speak, but his stance shifted subtly, aligning with his partner, a quiet show of solidarity. She could feel Mason's steady presence beside her, the warm bulk of his body pressed against her leg. He wasn't tense enough to bark, but he was reading them as carefully as she was. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly on the leash. "There's nothing dangerous about him," she said, "and I have the paperwork to prove it." She reached into her bag slowly, never breaking eye contact, and withdrew a slim folder containing the proof: veterinary records, licensing, certification from his training program. She held it out, but neither man made a move to take it. Instead, they exchanged a glance that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about a dog. It was about power, about establishing dominance over someone they had decided was worth targeting. The taller one took a step forward, closing the gap just enough that she could smell the faint odor of cigarette smoke clinging to his uniform. "Paperwork doesn't mean much when a dog decides to go for someone's throat," he said softly, his eyes dropping briefly to Mason before coming back to her face. Rhonda's mind began cataloging details. The distance between them was now less than 6 feet. His right hand lingered near the holster, the left loose at his side. The other officer stood a few feet back, angled slightly to her left, giving himself a line of approach that would let him flank her if things turned physical. Her breathing stayed steady, her face neutral, but inside, the shift from relaxed evening to high alert was complete. Without making it obvious, she slid her phone from her pocket, her thumb brushing the screen to wake it up. With a practiced motion, she started the camera recording, the lens peeking from between her fingers as she let her arm hang loosely at her side. Mason didn't move, his gaze locked on the two men, his body still but ready. The wind rustled the branches overhead, scattering a few leaves across the path between them. The sky had deepened into a richer shade of gold and indigo, the first stars faintly visible. It might still have been a perfect evening if not for the way the taller officer's voice cut through the air. Lower now, more pointed. "Control that animal," he said. It wasn't a request, wasn't a... The words hung there like the first distant rumble of thunder before a storm, and Rhonda knew with a cold certainty that whatever came next, the night was about to change forever. The command still lingered in the cooling air between them, as heavy as the scent of the grass and the smoke clinging to the taller officer's uniform. Control that animal. The tone wasn't official, it wasn't professional. It was personal. Rhonda could feel the power play behind it, the need to assert dominance simply because he could. Mason hadn't moved except to lift his head slightly higher, his warm breath steady against her leg. He was reading them too, and though his muscles were alert, his body language was calm. He was no threat, but she already understood that the facts of the moment didn't matter to the men in front of her. She kept her stance relaxed but rooted, her weight evenly balanced, every instinct she had from years of fighting and training quietly aligning. Her phone camera still recorded from her hand, catching the gleam of the officers' badges, the deliberate tilt of the taller one's chin. The silence between them stretched, and for a heartbeat she thought perhaps he would decide this wasn't worth it, that they would leave with a sneer and a parting insult. But then he shifted his weight forward, his right hand settling fully on the holstered weapon. Mason took a single step forward, not with aggression, but with the protective intuition of a dog who felt his person's tension. That was enough. The taller officer's eyes narrowed, his lips curling in a grim facsimile of a smile. The moment elongated into something strange and slow in Rhonda's mind. The last traces of sunlight caught the edge of the metal as the weapon cleared the holster, and before she could speak, before she could close the distance, the crack of the shot split the air. The sound was deafening at such close range, a brutal punctuation in the quiet park. The recoil snapped through the officer's arms, and Mason's body jerked with the impact, the force throwing him slightly off balance before his legs buckled beneath him. Time fractured for Rhonda into disjointed impressions, the sharp metallic tang of gunpowder, the dull thud of Mason's body hitting the path. The way the officer's finger still lingered near the trigger as if ready to fire again. She was moving before she even realized it, dropping to her knees beside Mason, the phone still in her hand, her free palm pressed gently to his side, feeling for the rhythm of his breathing. It was there, but shallow, rattling, a wet sound that broke her in ways no opponent ever had. His eyes found hers, still trusting, still certain she was there, but already clouded with confusion. She murmured his name, the word catching in her throat, her voice suddenly too small in the vastness of the park. The taller officer stepped closer, and she felt the shadow of his presence before she looked up. He was about to attack, he said flatly, loud enough for anyone within earshot to catch the justification. The other officer stood back, his gaze flickering between her and Mason, but he didn't step in. His silence was its own form of complicity. Her mind was a clean, cold line now, emotions burning down into something sharp and controlled. This was not the octagon. This was not sport. This was an unprovoked killing, and every fiber of her being registered it as such. Mason struggled for breath beneath her hand, his tail giving a faint, instinctive wag at her voice. She lowered herself closer so he could hear her, feel her near. "I'm here," she whispered. "I've got you." But she knew the truth pressing against the edges of her thoughts. There was nothing she could do for him now except bear witness. The other officer shifted his stance as if preparing to move in, and her focus snapped to him. The taller one barked over his shoulder, "We need to get her away from the animal." The phrasing was calculated, designed to strip away the word dog, to turn Mason into something dangerous in the narrative they would later tell. She tightened her grip on the leash that still connected her to him, as if that slender length of fabric could keep him with her. It was then she realized how many eyes were on them. A jogger had stopped on the path 20 feet away, phone held high. Near the bench where the elderly woman fed birds, someone else had their device pointed in her direction. 2 teenagers by the playground were recording openly, murmuring to each other in urgent voices. The presence of witnesses was both a comfort and a spark. Every second that passed was being documented beyond her own recording, and that meant the truth had more than one keeper. Mason's breathing faltered. She laid her palm against his ribs, feeling the stutter of his heartbeat as it fought to keep going. His gaze stayed locked on hers, and she felt the weight of everything he had been to her in that look. The morning runs, the long drives with his head out the window, the quiet nights when he'd lay his head in her lap as if to shield her from the world. His last exhale was soft, almost a sigh, and then he was still. Something in her chest clenched, but she did not collapse into the grief clawing at her. Not yet. That would come later in private. For now she absorbed the moment into that cold, precise space in her mind where all her training lived. The taller officer holstered his weapon, a theatrical motion meant to punctuate his authority. The other one's jaw was tight, his eyes avoiding hers. Her phone was still recording, and she adjusted the angle slightly, ensuring both men were in frame. The taller one must have noticed because his voice turned harder. "Ma'am, step away. Now." He reached out as if to grab her arm, and Mason's leash pulled from her grasp as she rose. She met his movement with stillness, the kind of stillness that made an opponent hesitate because they suddenly sensed the depth of the water they had stepped into. From somewhere behind her came a woman's voice, older and firm. "I saw the whole thing. That dog wasn't doing a damn thing." It was enough to make the second officer glance over his shoulder. The taller one ignored it, his eyes locked on Rhonda, perhaps recognizing, too late, that he had misjudged the situation. Her posture, her gaze, the control in her breathing, it all signaled someone who was not about to be cowed. The smell of gunpowder lingered in her nose, mixing with the scent of blood and earth. The leash hung slack in her hand now, weightless in a way that made her fingers ache. Her heartbeat was steady, her thoughts clear, and she understood with a kind of ruthless clarity that the moment for words was over. These men had made their choice, and soon she would make hers. For now she kept her voice level as she said, "You just killed my dog in cold blood." The taller officer's mouth opened to reply, but whatever script he intended to recite would have to wait, because the balance of this evening had shifted, and she was done playing the part they had imagined for her. The words she had spoken still hung in the air like smoke from the gun that had ended Mason's life. "You just killed my dog in cold blood." The taller officer's jaw twitched, a flicker of something crossing his face. Annoyance, perhaps even a trace of doubt. But it vanished beneath the same mask of authority he had worn from the moment he decided to make her his target. The other officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between her and the phones pointed in their direction from the growing ring of onlookers. The crowd wasn't large yet, but each person recording was a witness the department couldn't control, and that fact wasn't lost on her. Rhonda's heart was beating at the same measured pace it always did before a fight. Not the frantic pounding of panic, but the slow, steady rhythm of focus, the gathering of energy into something sharp and precise. Her grief was there, raw and biting, but it had retreated into a deeper place for now, pushed aside by the cold mechanics of what needed to happen next. Mason was gone. Nothing she did now could bring him back. But what had just been done to him, and the way they were already trying to twist it, demanded an answer. The taller officer stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the path. "Ma'am, step back," he ordered, the false politeness in his tone dissolving. His hand moved toward her arm, and in that moment she decided she would not allow him to put his hands on her. Not after this. Not ever. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, her weight balanced evenly. Her phone, still recording, slipped from her grasp onto the grass beside Mason's still body, but not before she angled it to keep both officers in frame. His fingers were just inches from her sleeve when she moved. She didn't telegraph the motion. Her years in the cage had taught her the value of surprise. She pivoted on the ball of her left foot, her right hand snapping up to trap his wrist in a grip that locked his thumb and rotated his elbow outward. The sudden torque forced a sharp gasp from him as pain shot up his arm. Before he could recover, she stepped in, driving her hip into his and using the leverage to throw him off balance. His gun was still holstered, but she wasn't going to give him the chance to change that. Her left hand clamped down on the butt of the weapon as she twisted, stripping it from the holster in a single smooth motion. The pistol was in her hand for only a heartbeat before she kicked it away, sending it skittering across the path toward the feet of a bystander who instinctively stepped on it to keep it from sliding further. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The taller officer stumbled, his arm still trapped in her grip, and she released him only to deliver a sharp palm strike to his sternum that sent him staggering backward, his breath driven out in a grunt. The second officer reacted then, his hand going for the collapsible baton at his belt. He snapped it out with a metallic crack, swinging it down toward her shoulder. She saw the arc of the weapon coming and slipped to her right, the swing slicing harmlessly through the air where she had been. Her counter came instantly, a low, snapping kick to the side of his thigh, just above the knee. The impact made a dull thud, and his leg buckled under him. He tried to recover, but she closed the distance, hooking her arm under his and using her momentum to lift and rotate him over her hip. The throw sent him to the ground hard, the breath whooshing out of him as he landed on his back. She didn't pause. She followed him down, trapping his wrist and pinning his arm across her thigh. Her free hand wrapped around his elbow, and with a controlled pull she applied pressure that made him cry out, the baton falling from his grip to clatter against the pavement. Her eyes were calm, unblinking, fixed on him as she kept the joint lock firm enough to immobilize, but not yet break. He was at her mercy, and he knew it. The taller officer had recovered enough to lunge toward her, but she shifted her weight, rolling smoothly away from the man on the ground and rising to her feet. As he came in, she stepped inside his reach, her hand snapping up to grab the front of his vest. With a pivot and a shift of her hips, she redirected his momentum, sending him stumbling past her. He caught himself spinning to face her again, but now his expression had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something colder. The realization that she was not prey. Around them the crowd had grown, their voices a low murmur of shock and disbelief. Phones were up everywhere, recording from every angle. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, growing closer. She knew backup was on the way. She also knew she couldn't allow these two to recover and escalate the situation before more eyes could witness what had happened here. She advanced on the taller officer, her steps deliberate. He backed up instinctively, his hand twitching toward where his gun had been before he remembered she had taken it from him. Her hand shot forward, seizing his wrist and twisting it behind his back in a textbook control hold. His grunt of pain was cut short as she reached for the set of handcuffs clipped to his belt and, with one fluid motion, snapped one cuff around his wrist and the other to the sturdy metal leg of a nearby park bench. He was secured, bent slightly forward, his face red with effort and humiliation. The second officer was on his knees, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. She crossed to him quickly, planting a knee into his back as she grabbed his arms, pulling them behind him. His own cuffs were in her hand before he realized what was happening, and in seconds he too was restrained, his chest pressed to the cool asphalt, the weight of her knee keeping him still. She stepped back, breathing evenly, surveying the two immobilized men. The crowd was silent now, save for the faint hum of more sirens drawing near. She walked back to where her phone lay in the grass, picking it up and checking the screen. The recording was still going. The entire confrontation captured without interruption. She turned the camera on herself briefly, her voice steady. These two officers killed my dog without provocation and attempted to manhandle me. They are now restrained until other units arrive. This is being documented for everyone's safety. When she turned the lens back toward them, both men avoided looking directly at it. The taller officer's jaw was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line, while the other simply closed his eyes, his breath still uneven from the throw. The onlookers began to speak up now, voices calling out what they had seen, some moving closer to offer their own recordings. Rhonda kept her gaze on the approaching lights beyond the trees, the flash of red and blue growing brighter. Her breathing was still calm, her body loose but ready. She had no intention of fighting anyone else, but she was not about to relinquish control of the scene until she knew there were more witnesses than just the cameras in her hands. Mason's leash still hung from her wrist, the loop of it swaying gently in the evening breeze. She could feel the absence at the other end of it like a phantom weight. The grief was there, coiled tight in her chest, but it would wait. For now she had made sure the first blow in this fight was hers, and it had landed exactly where she intended. The flashing lights grew larger between the trees, the wail of the sirens slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. Rhonda stood exactly where she had been when she retrieved her phone, both restrained officers in clear view. The loop of Mason's leash still around her wrist like a reminder she could not shake off. The taller officer's head jerked up at the sound of his reinforcements, his posture stiffening as though he could somehow recover the authority he had lost. The second officer remained still, his cheek pressed against the asphalt, his breathing uneven, the metal of his own cuffs cutting into his wrists. When the first backup unit appeared on the path, its headlights flooding the scene, the two new officers froze at the sight. Their partners were immobilized, subdued not by a weapon, but by a woman in athletic clothes who stood calm and ready, flanked by a ring of onlookers with phones aimed like an unblinking wall of glass eyes. The crowd parted slightly, giving the newcomers a clear line of sight to everything. The two restrained men, Mason's still body on the grass, the leash dangling from Rhonda's wrist, the phone in her hand, still recording. One of the new arrivals stepped forward, his palm raised slightly in a gesture that was neither hostile nor submissive. "Ma'am," he began, but Rhonda's eyes locked on him with such measured steadiness that he faltered. She could read him instantly. He had been told to assess the situation before acting, likely aware that the presence of cameras made any misstep irreversible. She spoke before he could try again. "They shot my dog without provocation," she said clearly, her voice carrying over the quiet that had settled among the crowd. "It's all on video, not just mine." She tilted her head toward the semicircle of onlookers. "But theirs too. Multiple witnesses, every second of it." She kept her tone even, not shouting, not pleading, just stating the truth like an anchor dropped into deep water. The officer's gaze flicked toward the two restrained men, then back to her. He seemed to measure the weight of the moment, the weight of those cameras, before nodding slightly. He gestured to his partner, who began speaking quietly into the radio clipped to his shoulder. The sirens of additional units drew closer, and soon more headlights swept across the path as another patrol car arrived from the opposite direction. The crowd was no longer just neighbors and passers-by. She recognized the distinct shuffle of feet that belonged to reporters rushing to the scene, their voices low as they prepped equipment. The first cameraman appeared at the edge of the group, the shoulder rig rising above the heads of the onlookers. A reporter with a handheld mic followed, her hair catching the glow of the lights, her eyes already fixed on Rhonda. "Can you tell us what happened here?" she asked, her voice sharp with that mix of urgency and hunger that came from smelling a headline. Rhonda took a moment to glance at the leash around her wrist, then at Mason's body a few feet away, lying in the darkening grass. "What happened," she said slowly, "is that two armed police officers decided to harass a woman walking her dog in the park. When the dog, who was leashed, licensed, and fully trained, stepped forward to protect me from their aggression, one of them shot him dead. No warning, no justification. And when I refused to be manhandled, they tried to put their hands on me." She didn't add that they had failed spectacularly. The footage spoke for itself. The reporter's brows knit together as she took in the words, clearly aware that the story unfolding here was already bigger than she could have anticipated. The crowd shifted, making space for another voice. An older woman from earlier, the one who had spoken up when the shot was still fresh in the air. "I saw it all," she called out. "That dog wasn't doing anything. They just shot him." Others chimed in, their voices overlapping, each adding another thread to the growing tapestry of testimony that would be impossible to ignore. The officers from the backup units moved cautiously, but there was no attempt to free the two restrained men. If anything, they seemed relieved to keep their distance. One of them knelt beside Mason, checking for a pulse that Rhonda knew wasn't there. His expression tightened when he looked back at her, a brief acknowledgement passing between them before he stood and stepped away. By the time the third and fourth news crews arrived, the path was a flood of light from camera rigs and phone screens. The heat from the lamps made the night air feel heavy, but Rhonda didn't move from her position. She answered questions only when they were direct, never breaking the controlled cadence of her speech. Her phone continued to record, capturing not just the events, but the atmosphere, the way the officers stood stiffly, the murmur of the crowd, the occasional flash from a still camera. Somewhere beyond the immediate circle, she heard a voice she recognized, a sports journalist she'd known from her fighting days. He was talking quickly into his phone, describing the scene, his tone charged. She realized with a strange sense of detachment that this was going to be everywhere by morning, not because she was Ronda Rousey, but because the story was too incendiary to contain. A decorated fighter restraining two armed officers after they killed her dog in a public park. A rustle of movement came from her right, and she turned to see a uniformed sergeant arriving, his face set in a mask of official neutrality. He surveyed the scene for several long moments before stepping toward her. "We need to sort this out," he said, his voice pitched low enough that it didn't carry far. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "It's already sorted," she replied. "They're restrained for everyone's safety, and the entire incident is documented on multiple devices. I'm not handing them over until there are enough witnesses present to make sure nothing disappears." Her tone left no room for debate. The sergeant studied her for a beat longer, then nodded once and stepped back. The cameras caught everything. The disciplined stillness in her posture, the officers on the ground, the crowd pressing closer. Somewhere in the back, someone began a slow clap, quickly joined by others. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it carried, and the shift in energy was tangible. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a public reckoning. Rhonda felt the first wave of adrenaline ebb, leaving behind the ache of reality. Mason was gone. The space at her side where he should have been was as stark as the pool of light from the news cameras. But she stood straighter, knowing that grief could not be the only legacy of this night. The footage, the witnesses, the questions already being shouted by reporters, these were tools and she intended to use them. When the decision was finally made to remove the restrained officers, it was done under the full glare of lights and lenses. The handcuffs clicked open only to be replaced by others, their own colleagues taking custody with visibly tight jaws. They were led away without a word, the taller one's face pale beneath the lights. The crowd erupted in a low murmur, some voices triumphant, others simply stunned. Rhonda watched them go, the loop of Mason's leash still warm against her skin. She knew this was only the first step. The real fight, the one for justice, for truth, was only beginning, and this time the arena was much larger, the stakes far higher. As the cameras closed in for one last shot, she looked straight into a lens and said, "This doesn't end here." The footage from the park spread faster than even Rhonda had anticipated. By the time she returned home that night, Mason's leash coiled in her hand like a silent witness. Her phone had become an incessant chorus of alerts. News outlets ran the story on loop, alternating between the raw cell phone videos and carefully worded commentary from anchors who seemed both shocked and eager to press the question of what this meant for the department. Some networks framed it as a clear-cut case of police brutality, others as a troubling incident still under investigation. Online, the reaction was far less restrained. Hashtags calling for justice for Mason surged into trending lists. Her name trended alongside his, though she knew the attention wasn't because of her fighting career. It was because she had done something most people only imagined. She had taken control when power was abused. The morning after, she woke to the smell of coffee and the faint rumble of voices from the television in the other room. She didn't need to check the screen to know the story was still running. It had already taken on a momentum of its own. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at Mason's collar lying in front of her. The metal tag caught the light in the quiet room, reflecting a distorted glimmer onto her hands. She ran her thumb over his name etched into the metal, the ache in her chest sharp and constant. The house felt emptier than it had in years. Her lawyer, Paul Whitman, arrived just after 9, a thick folder under his arm. He had been a friend before he'd been her legal counsel, and his expression was grim as he set the folder on the table. "They're coming hard," he said without preamble. "I've already seen drafts of internal reports. They're painting Mason as aggressive, claiming you escalated the situation, and—" He hesitated, flipping open the folder to reveal still shots from grainy security footage. "They're shopping this to the media as an exclusive. Claims to show you provoking the officers." Rhonda looked at the photos without touching them. In the still images, her body language was deliberately misrepresented frames, chosen from moments mid-movement, taken out of context, meant to make her stance look aggressive rather than defensive. She recognized the tactic immediately. "Fabrication," she said flatly. Paul nodded. "They'll also try to push charges. Assault on law enforcement, resisting arrest. Nothing they can make stick with the amount of video out there, but enough to muddy the waters." As if on cue, her phone rang, the number unfamiliar but local. She put it on speaker. "Ms. Rousey, this is Detective Collins with the Internal Affairs Division," the voice said, the tone deceptively smooth. "We'd like you to come down to the station for a formal interview regarding the incident in the park." Paul mouthed the words, "Don't go." She replied evenly, "All questions can go through my attorney." The pause on the line was brief, but she could hear the irritation under the man's professional veneer. "That's your choice," he said, "but refusing to cooperate can be seen as obstruction." She hung up without another word. The threats didn't end there. By midday, anonymous messages began arriving. Some sent directly to her social media accounts, others left as voicemails on her public contact line. They were all variations of the same ugly theme, telling her to keep quiet, to let it go, to remember what happens to people who make trouble. The language was often crude, sometimes violent, but the intent was always the same. They wanted her scared, They wanted her to feel alone. She wasn't. The doorbell rang just after 2, and when she opened it, she found Paul standing there again, this time accompanied by 2 people she hadn't expected to see. A pair of well-known civil rights attorneys who had taken on police misconduct cases across the country. One of them, Angela Morris, shook her hand firmly. "We saw the footage," Angela said. "We also saw the coordinated smear campaign starting up. We're here to make sure they can't twist this." The other, David Lang, set down a laptop on her dining table and began pulling up files. "The 2 officers you restrained aren't first-timer," he said. "Both have prior complaints, use of excessive force, destruction of property, unlawful discharge of a firearm. Most of those complaints disappeared before any real consequences." Rhonda absorbed the information without surprise. She had suspected as much from the moment she saw their faces. "We make this public," she said. "All of it. Every complaint, every cover-up." Paul cautioned her. "That will make the department double down. They'll throw everything they have at you." She met his eyes steadily. "Let them." The following day, she held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by Angela, David, and Paul. The cameras clicked in a constant rhythm as she stepped up to the podium. "2 days ago," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd, "my dog was shot and killed without provocation by an armed officer while we were walking in the park. When those same officers attempted to detain me without cause, I defended myself. The truth of what happened is on multiple recordings and confirmed by witnesses. But instead of accountability, the department has chosen lies, intimidation, and threats." She paused, letting the silence gather before she continued. "I will not be silenced. I will not be intimidated. And I will not stop until there is justice, not just for Mason, but for everyone who has been targeted and silenced by those sworn to protect them." The statement hit harder than even she anticipated. Within hours, clips of her speech were running alongside the park footage, the narrative shifting further from isolated incident to a broader conversation about police accountability. But the more traction the truth gained, the more intense the pushback became. That evening, Paul forwarded her an email sent to him anonymously. It contained nothing but a photo Mason's collar, sitting on her kitchen table, exactly as it had been that morning. The image had been taken from inside her home. The message was clear. They could reach her whenever they wanted. Instead of fear, the intrusion stoked something else in her, a deep, iron steadiness. They had crossed into her home, into her sanctuary, and she understood now that there was no middle ground. This was a fight that would not end until one side had been broken. She turned to Paul, Angela, and David, who were still at the table, their laptops open, documents and timelines spreading out between them. "Then we don't wait for them to come again," she said. "We go on the offensive." And as she spoke, the coil of Mason's leash around her wrist felt less like a weight and more like a tether to purpose, pulling her forward into the storm she knew was coming next. The night after discovering the photograph of Mason's collar taken from within her own home, Rhonda did not sleep. The image played over and over in her mind, not as a source of fear, but as fuel, igniting something fierce and immovable deep inside her. She had endured grief, threats, and smear campaigns. But this was different. This was an invasion of her most private space, a deliberate message that she was vulnerable. The truth, however, was the opposite. The moment they crossed that line, they gave her exactly what she needed, a reason to act without restraint. The next morning, her living room had transformed into a war room. Paul was there before dawn, coffee in hand, his eyes shadowed but determined. Angela and David arrived shortly after, carrying thick binders and flash drives containing everything they had dug up on the officers and their allies in the department. Maps of the city, surveillance photos, and timelines were spread across the table. Every thread of corruption they had uncovered, every falsified report, every vanished complaint, every payout buried under administrative settlements was now part of a clear picture. This was not just about two officers in the park. It was an entrenched network of protection for abusers in uniform. Rhonda stood at the head of the table, scanning the material like she was studying an opponent before a championship fight. "They think intimidation works," she said finally. "They're used to people folding under pressure. That's how they've kept this going for so long." David leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "They won't see you coming. They still think you're just a fighter. They don't understand that you've been training for battles like this your entire life." The strategy was twofold. Publicly, they would file a civil suit not only against the officers involved, but also against the department leadership for systemic failure and cover-ups. Privately, they would work with federal contacts to initiate an investigation that could lead to criminal charges. Every witness was tracked down, every piece of video evidence backed up and stored in multiple secure locations. Rhonda personally visited some of the witnesses' residents from the park that day, store owners who had seen the officers in other confrontations. Her presence, her directness, seemed to break through the fear that had kept so many silent. People began talking. Patterns emerged. Stories that had been buried for years came to light. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated. Anonymous vehicles lingered outside her home at night, engines idling. Twice her mail was tampered with. Social media trolls multiplied, repeating the same coordinated talking points that painted her as a violent instigator. None of it slowed her. If anything, the constant pressure sharpened her focus. Every time she laced up her gloves in the gym, she imagined she was preparing not for a physical opponent, but for the courtroom, for the endless cross-examinations, for the smug faces of those who thought themselves untouchable. When the day of the first court hearing arrived, the courthouse steps were crowded. Supporters held signs with Mason's name, others with images from the park footage. Journalists jostled for position, microphones and cameras pointed in her direction. She walked up the steps flanked by her legal team, her posture unflinching. Inside, the defense tried to paint the incident as a tragic misunderstanding, the kind that happens in the heat of the moment. But the videos played in full for the court told a different story, one of unprovoked aggression and deliberate escalation by the officers. In cross-examination, Angela dismantled their testimonies piece by piece, using their own reports to expose contradictions. When the department's internal affairs representative tried to claim that the officers' prior complaints were unsubstantiated, David presented evidence showing that multiple witnesses in those cases had been threatened or coerced into withdrawing their statements. The defense faltered. The room could feel the shift, the sense that the usual playbook wasn't working. Outside the courtroom, the pressure on the department grew unbearable. Federal investigators announced that they were opening a probe into the leadership's handling of misconduct cases. Whistleblowers began stepping forward, some anonymously, others willing to attach their names. What had started as one woman's fight for her dog's memory was becoming a reckoning for the entire city. The verdict in the civil case came after weeks of testimony. The jury found the officers guilty of wrongful death, excessive force, and violation of civil rights. Damages were awarded in the millions, not that the money mattered to Rhonda. What mattered was that the verdict was read aloud in open court, the words "guilty" echoing in the room. The officers were immediately taken into custody pending separate criminal trials. Yet the real victory came weeks later, When the results of the federal investigation were announced, several high-ranking officials in the department were indicted for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Policies were rewritten, and a civilian oversight board with real authority was established. The same park where Mason had been killed was renamed in his honor, Mason's Run a Green Space, dedicated to service dogs and canine training programs for veterans and first responders. On the day the new sign was unveiled, Rhonda stood at the edge of the park, a new pit bull pup at her side. She had named him Valor, a quiet promise to herself that she would never stop fighting for those without a voice. The crowd that had gathered was a mixture of friends, supporters, and strangers whose lives had been touched by her battle. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the wind. She knelt beside Valor, adjusting his collar, and felt a strange peace settle over her. Mason's absence would always ache, but his memory had become something larger than grief. It had become a shield for others. As she straightened, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass. Paul, standing beside her, asked quietly, "So what now?" Rhonda looked out over the park, watching people walk dogs, talk with neighbors, move freely without fear. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "we keep going, because there's always another fight, and I'm not done yet." And as she walked forward, Valor trotting at her side, she knew that this chapter of her life was closed, not with quiet surrender, but with the unmistakable clarity of justice delivered. Subscribe for more stories like this. Check out our other videos and share this one with your friends so they can watch too.